to you out there. Welcome home again. We're glad you're here. This is Janice Pons, and I am your host on From Destruction to Dignity. And I have my first guest, the lovely, the vivacious, the amazingly talented expertise, just a woman that I've known for a number of years. Had the honor and pleasure to work with her. And I think, she look at her, she's gorgeous. And you know what? She knows what she's doing, and she is a psychologist, a clinical psychologist. This is my first guest, Dr. Heather Gillum. And we want to say welcome.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm honored.
Yes, I love Heather. I fell in love with Heather when I first met her. And she and I worked together in a clinical setting here in Tulsa, and her husband was there. The guy, when she first came, he wasn't her husband, and I said, "You came over there to find your husband, girl." And anyway, so they're married. I love both of them. They're just stellar professionals, amazingly anointed professionals, and they're just good at what they do. And so I just so much enjoy working with both of them. And so Heather is, as I said, a psychologist.
Yes.
And clinical psychologist.
Yes.
Clinical psychologist, and she does have an expertise in an area of eating disorders. Eating disorders. And there's so many people in our society, so many people in the world that this is a challenge. Some of them don't know that that's what they've got going on. And so we just want to shed some light on that, because sometimes, as you've heard me talk about, this is episode 10. And from the previous episodes that I've done, that we've just talked about, sometimes people are alcoholic and they don't know that they're alcoholic. Sometimes people can have an eating disorder. They don't know that they have one. They can have disordered eating. They don't know that that's what's going on. And so Heather and I, we're going to just go on a flow. She's going to be with us this episode and the next, because there's so much to cover. And I just knew in my heart of hearts that we needed to do two. And so, Heather, one thing that, I had thrown this out to you before is can people get addicted to food?
They can. Yeah, absolutely. You can get addicted to just about anything. And so we know people in our lives, people can become addicted to food, and we don't always know when that starts or how it ends.
Mm-hmm.
That may or may not be an eating disorder or leading to an eating disorder. It just sort of depends on the course of their life, depends on what started it and
Mm-hmm.
what's keeping it going. Eating disorders at their core are not addictions. They're based on stress, they're based on anxiety, but addiction can be part of that. And as we know, when people are struggling with addiction, a lot of times they are self-medicating to deal with anxiety, to deal with stress. And so in that way, there can be some similarities.
Interesting. Now you got my attention. Certain things people say, and it's like, stop. Let's dissect that a little bit. So, eating disorders, am I correct in saying you said they're directly related to stress and anxiety?
Yes.
Look in the camera and elaborate on that a little bit.
Okay. Well, I mean, when people have what we would call, a diagnostic or full-blown eating disorder, then what we're dealing with at that point is what we know from the research is that there's a genetic predisposition that they're struggling with, whether they're eating too much, whether they're not eating enough, or whether they're eating normally but struggling with what we would call eating disorder behaviors. So there's a wide range of difficulties that can emerge from that. But what we know is that there is almost always a genetic component that has to do with how we handle anxiety, how we handle stress, the parts of the brain that help us feel full, parts of the brain that allow us to feel hunger, that allow us to taste our food. There can be differences in brain functioning for people that might struggle with disordered eating. And so that's sort of the foundation, right, for eating disorders. And then behaviors come into that, what they're eating, how they're eating over time.
What's the difference between disordered eating and an eating disorder?
Well, it would be, as with any other difficulty in human functioning, when it reaches the point that you're having medical complications or it's disruptive to the activities of daily life. That's usually kind of the diagnostic cutoff. So there can be some gray area in there for any given patient, depending on what they're struggling with.
As evidenced by what? Medical complications, disruption of daily life, as evidenced by what?
Such as, and it's a long list.
Okay.
Depending on the illness, or the type of eating disorder. But when a doctor is looking at your vitals and
Mhm.
something's not right, we're looking at blood pressure changes, we're looking at changes in the heart's functioning, changes in breathing. A lot of times, what we'll see, and I saw this a lot with young people, and would hear this from parents, families that were involved, would tell us that something's just not right. They're just not quite as sharp. They're not themselves. You were talking in your last episode about alcohol and the impact on the brain. And so you start to see some of the cognitive impact. People are just not quite as clear. And those are sometimes indications that there could be something going on. And sometimes it's very subtle. It's a very subtle process for a lot of people. It takes some time to notice.
Okay. So that's the physiological. What are some activities of daily living that we might see? It's like, kind of like some red flags.
Sure, yeah. If people are tired, if they're not feeling right, if they're not functioning well at work, they're not getting around, not taking care of themselves. If there's an increase in anxiety, if there's an increase in depression, sometimes there can be actually a decrease in their baseline of anxiety and depression because they're using eating or food or lack thereof or the behaviors that come from that in order to decrease anxiety and depression. So what we're looking for is changes relative to what you would see at a person's normal baseline.
Okay. So when we see changes in that, when we start seeing patterns of change that's affecting their daily functioning, where it's declining and there's a concern, it's like it could be related to disordered eating or an eating disorder.
It could be.
Could be. Okay. Now, when I grew up, this was something that would happen. It was like, who got the last pork chop that was on the stove? Okay. So it was like a fight for the food. And this could happen a lot in larger families. And when I first met you, where we were working, they had an eating disorder program. I think they still had it. I'm not sure. I think, but eventually that program phased out. But a lot of the people that would come in that were extremely overweight, that was a dynamic that went on in their family. It was like always fighting. They just didn't know if they were going to be able to, if it was going to be enough food. And they would say, they took my pork chop. And so fights would ensue around food. And so they developed a bad relationship with food. Sure. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit, about a relation? Do we have relationships with food?
Yeah, we do. How we approach food or how we avoid food or what we do with food.
Okay.
But I think, what you're describing there is a picture of how anxiety and stress can come about and start developing early in life. So we may have some genetic difficulties or dispositions that would lead us in one direction or another. But then you would have circumstantial or environmental dynamics or experiences, sometimes even trauma, that would impact our relationship with food. I've had many patients over the years that experienced some sort of trauma or difficulty in life, and food was part of that picture in one way or another. So when you start to see that anxiety over food or the stress related to it, or if food is the answer to anxiety and stress in their particular context, those are some of the things that can be the environmental underpinnings of an eating disorder.
I really want you to talk about that trauma a little bit. I want you to lean into that, because a lot of people are traumatized and they don't even know that they're traumatized. It's like you got some major issues with trauma. And one thing that I've seen over the years is there are different types of trauma. Is trauma is something that happened to you that should not have happened, such as a physical, sexual, emotional, verbal abuse, spiritual abuse, financial abuse, something happened to you that should not have happened. Neglect, you didn't receive something that you should have received, appropriate attention from your dad. You were never held, you were never nurtured. That's a traumatizing experience. And then some people actually traumatize themselves over and over again. So there are different types of trauma, and sometimes people we for Black Americans, there's a history of historical trauma, and they never relate that to what is coming out, lashing out as anger. And I love to work with people that's got that issue going on. By and large, Black people don't show up for the therapeutic process. And so when they do, I know that is a major opportunity for breakthrough because they haven't even acknowledged, oh, the historical trauma. What you mean? That's why I'm offended. I mean, I haven't even looked at that. Wow. And so a lot of times anger is not even the primary emotion. That's what comes out. They cussing people out, throwing things and tearing stuff up. You see it on Facebook, Black folk beating each other up to a pulp. And I'm like, baby, what are we doing? What are you doing? And a lot of times it's not even the primary emotion. And folks say, don't miss them Black folk. They fight, cuss, cut. That's not the primary emotion. I've seen it over and over again. A lot of times it's fear. Sometimes it's embarrassment, it's shame, it's guilt, whatever. So we don't they carry this historical trauma and they trying to bring that stuff back all over again, that we're oppressed. The white man's got us down. He's got his foot on our neck. And so we never get ahead. And so we're always angry, always angry, always angry. And God has a better way. I digress a little bit, but not really. Not really. Not really. Because these types of unresolved things can lead to we're stressed out. We're all anxious about that and we all worked up and I'm gonna go out there and fight. And then we end up doing things like it may affect our eating habits. So trauma. I want you to go there a little bit with that trauma.
Sure.
Because that's a real issue. And we a lot of time you and I had talked about that. You had read some article about that sometimes disordered eating or even an eating disorder can be very prevalent in the Black community and not have a clue. Same with alcoholism. We haven't even given a language to it. We don't even know what it is. What does it look like? What are the signs, symptoms? What's going on? Talk about that a little bit.
Well, trauma is varied, right? So there can be a variety of different types of trauma and different contexts in which that occurs. Mm-hmm. But one thing that we know about trauma, and there's a really wonderful text, I have no stock in this or whatever, but it's called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's a really wonderful piece that's been out there for a long time that really addresses the fact that our body keeps track. Our body keeps track of what we've been through emotionally, relationally, physically, all of those things.
That's a deep thought.
Yes.
Our bodies keep track.
Yes. Yeah. And it's called The Body Keeps the Score. Mm-hmm. So over time, sometimes those things will emerge, given the perfect storm of events, of difficulties or of stressors in life. And sometimes that can emerge in a context that doesn't make a lot of sense to people because, they might be dealing with one particular stressor and think that's really not related to my eating, but when they start to kind of look at that, then they start to see things within their history that point to areas of anxiety and stress and where food came into that picture or where behaviors around food came into that picture. So our mind and our body keep track of those things.
Give an example of behaviors around food. Just provoke our thought there a little bit more.
So, and this is another thing where it's, we could talk for 3 or 4 hours about the number of behaviors, but anything that people are doing to control, to alter their eating, to alter their intake, undoing behaviors is something that happens sometimes if people are overeating. So you might see cycles of binging and purging. You might see patterns of restriction where people are willing to cook for the family and do all kinds of things for them, but they're kind of pushing food around, or they're using some sort of behavior to get rid of the food, either to not consume it at all or to get rid of it once they've consumed it. Wow. So there are a variety of things out there that people can really get stuck in. Long lists of behaviors that can be specific to things like anorexia, bulimia.
And in our next episode, we are going to talk specifically about specific eating disorders, because I remember the place where we met. there was an eating disorders program, and I was just kind of blown away. I'd never really seen it. I remember the first eating disorder I'd ever heard of was when Karen Carpenter, I'm kind of dating myself, Karen Carpenter had anorexia nervosa. Never heard the term in my life, but it didn't sound good. I remember thinking that I was like, anorexia nervosa, what is that? And I think she actually, it affected her heart, if I recall correctly. And I think I was in the 70s, and I was like, what is that? And no one had, and black folks certainly hadn't heard of it. It was like, that's something we don't talk about in our community or in our culture per se, particularly back then. Of course, as a result of time passing, we get exposed to more information and knowledge and just learn more. But that was a strange term back then. Uh, but you know, we're going to get into the next episode. We're going to talk about specific eating disorders, signs, symptoms, and treatment thereof. And um, when when a person realizes that they may be in trouble, okay, kind of how may they know that they're in trouble? That when I say in trouble, it's just like, wait a minute. I know you've talked about, well, they're tired and they're not themselves. Well, that fits other things too. Okay.
Sure.
So how might we know? It's like, wow, I need to look at that area. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Could be when they're experiencing weight gain or weight loss that would not be explained by any other reason.
Yeah.
That might be an indication. When they're having to hide what they're doing, right? When they start to become rather secretive about their eating, about getting rid of food, about the undoing behaviors, secretive exercise to lose weight, body image related concerns can go into that as well.
Mm.
When things start to become hidden, that's usually a pretty good indicator.
Wow.
That
Hidden.
they are struggling. Yeah, things are hidden from people.
That's interesting. I was talking to a coworker recently, and they were saying someone they know that this person is just gaining weight, but the pattern that this person is in is that about 11 o'clock at night, going and getting the children's snack and just gorging herself with the children's snacks, and it's 11 o'clock at night. This is when you're supposed to be in bed, getting rest, and so it's like warning, red flags, so things such as that. Wow.
And the isolation, I mean, the pandemic that people are living through all over the world.
Yeah.
That level of isolation, you were talking about isolation in your prior episode as well. That's a huge factor. Whether people are struggling with overeating or undereating or all of the behaviors around that, the research is already telling us that the isolation of the pandemic has created some difficulty there.
I saw an article 2 or 3 weeks ago that said last year the average American gained 20 pounds last year. That's not good. So anyway, wow, that has a lot of implications as well. And even when I went to get my physical in January, I gained some weight. I guess I was amongst the Americans that had gained some. And the doctor said, "Hey, here's the deal. What I saw with COVID is that all of my patients gained weight." And he said, "Now here's what we're gonna do, because you got to get baseline lab work." He said, "You're gonna either walk, Janice, walk." Or we're going to have to look at some areas of something that we might need to do something different. I said, let Janice have the opportunity to walk, Janice walk. And I came down 2 pant sizes by just walking and doing this, what I've talked about in the 8 before 8, just the stretching and the certain exercises and just walking on my lunch break. So it's just incorporating those strategies. That's part of my strategy, skills, and tools. But he just said, all of his patients gained weight last year. Yeah. So those are factors that keep involved. So, what are the different levels of intervention that you can get?
Sure.
Once it's like, okay, there's something going on here. What can we do? What's going on?
Well, and it also depends on the illness, right? So if we're talking about everybody in the pandemic, kind of a cultural experience that we've had of gaining more weight, that's kind of the direction we lean, and that's where most people lean. But there are also patients that struggle with undereating, and the pandemic has been equally devastating for them as well. And so it gets to be, a thing of, I'm a big proponent of healthy at every size, but it's about balancing that eating, and at the very beginning in the first kind of stage of of getting help is, working with the dietitian and making sure that you're on a meal plan that works for you, whether you need to gain weight, whether you need to lose weight, or whether you need to just hold steady. The initial goal is usually not going to be to make any dramatic changes. It's going to be to stabilize the nutrition, because that's what you're going to need for your internal organs to be repaired and to start working effectively for you. So it differs. Getting back to your question, if we're just struggling with like pandemic related overeating, then at that point you can talk to your physician usually, and most people will be able to kind of trend toward their baseline and kind of where their body is made to be and where it's meant to be. But then it gets a little bit different depending on whether people are struggling with overeating or undereating. Patients that are struggling with severe undereating are usually going to need to be at the highest level of care for a hospitalization once they reach a certain point in their difficulty with eating.
So we're looking at BMI at that time?
Yeah, that and a number of factors. BMI, how their organs are functioning, what their weight is, what the timeline is for the weight loss, what they're consuming on a daily basis, things like that. So there might be an acute hospitalization for patients who are really struggling with being severely underweight, or who are struggling with a variety of behaviors that are medically compromising for them. If they're struggling with overexercise or purging, things like that. But stepping down from there would be residential levels of care. And that's where you're still in the hospital, but you're not necessarily in the acute stage of maybe being in a hospital bed.
Right.
And then partial hospitalization, where people start to go home at night. They're starting to eat with their family again, kind of gradually working their way back in to normal patterns at home. But they're in the program during the day, or maybe through the afternoon and evening, and needing some sort of meal support. Intensive outpatient usually kind of cuts those hours down. So again, a gradual step down. So you're meeting with groups of people for a few hours a day, or a few days, for a few hours, a few days each week. Many programs work very differently. It just depends on how they're structured. And then from there, outpatient, where you're seeing your dietitian, you're seeing your doctor, you're seeing your psychiatrist, your psychologist, therapist, and then from there can be a variety of services, meal support groups, things like that.
Wow.
And sometimes there's an integration of those things all the way through.
Wow. And which leads me to what you do.
Yes.
Talk about you and what you do.
So I spent a number of years working in inpatient settings, both in general clinical psychology and specializing in eating disorders.
Right.
And so with the pandemic and changes in our family, it was a time to make a transition. And so I am doing telehealth, exclusively telehealth for eating disorders. I practice in a large and kind of growing number of states across the country.
Wow.
And what we saw for years is that many patients would go back to their home after hospitalization and struggle to find providers in their local area that knew how to deal with eating disorders. There would be all kinds of physicians out there. Pediatricians would say, "Oh, you're losing weight. You look great." In a world where we're fighting the epidemic of obesity, that sort of makes sense, but those rules don't apply to everybody and every kind of eating disorder.
Right.
So that was my transition, reaching out to people across the country that have difficulty accessing.
So Rachel is going to put up on the screen how to get in touch with Dr. Heather Gillum. On my website, www.janicepons.com, I have a page on my website that says resources. And Dr. Heather Gillum is one of the resources. She is the resource that I have on there in terms of individual therapy related to eating disorders. And I think on there's something about group, maybe even where you could get referred to for if you need a more intensive level of care. But I mean, there are different links on there that you can click on my website, www.janicepons.com. Go to the resource page, and you will have it's going to tell you if it's substance abuse, if it's eating disorders, if someone is a threat to themselves or others. Of course, you need to call 911. You want to get shared liability. And I learned the hard way early on in my career. Shared liability at a minimal is called the police. You get somebody else involved other than you trying to figure out what's going on. Get somebody else involved. That's wisdom. That's the wisdom of God. And so you will be able to click. Dr. Gillum is one of the resources on there. You'll go straight to her website. Excellent website. I love it. I remember when you were putting it together, I would say, go ahead on, Heather. Step on out there. And so it's just really well done. And Heather is just an amazing person. So in terms of, let's say, gosh, you said something about health. You use a term, a phrase, healthy.
Healthy at every size.
Talk about that a little bit, because we got all kind of sizes,
That's
you know,
right.
and folk just, they trying to get down to a 10. It's like, baby, that was high school. You're not going to get back down to a 10.
Yeah.
So maybe they will, but
Yeah.
talk about that a little bit. Healthy at every size.
So Healthy at Every Size, HAES, is the acronym that you may find. And there are lots of different kind of themes and movements within the eating disorder treatment and advocacy community.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is sort of Heather Vision description.
Yeah.
That it's really targeting the reality that, our body is meant to be somewhere. We were created and we were made to be what we're made to be. And everybody's size is different. And so we can be thin, we can be large, and there are ways to balance your health and be strong and be healthy. And of course work with your doctors to do what you need to do. But it's really an initiative to get away from the idea of judging based on people's thinness or thickness or otherwise. And I probably have not represented Healthy at Every Size in the movement the way they intend. So you'd have to go to the website and see that. But that's my position in the advocacy for that.
Well, what I'm hearing is balance.
Yes.
Balance. So you might not want to go there. I'm not sure. I want to respect your boundaries. So what's their trajectory? What are they trying to, what's their goal?
Again, recognizing that there can be strength and beauty in every size of a body, right? Because what we've seen this is, again, a whole nother issue that we could talk for hours about, the impact of media on our beliefs about what our bodies should be like, especially women.
Yeah.
And there are differences within cultures, within different areas, even in this country, but the media has done a number, especially on young women and kids that are growing up, their views, and not just women. They're, boys, men are under-identified usually when it comes to eating disorders as well. So the Healthy at Every Size movement and those like it are recognizing and making a really great effort at recognizing that there's diversity in our health and in our difficulties.
So am I hearing you say that someone can be over size 14 or maybe over size 14 and still be healthy?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. And I see so many women put so much pressure on themselves. Like these young girls, when I met you and we had that eating disorder program there, I was just like blown away at what I saw about these girls just focused on getting so skinny. And I saw people that were emaciated. They were just like skin and bones and they thought they were fat. I was just like, wow, help me understand. And in the next episode, we're going to get into with Dr. Gillum, Heather Gillum. We're going to talk about some of those eating disorders. So join in with us next week. We're going to just dissect a little bit more. This is From Destruction to Dignity. My first guest, I love her so much. She's amazing. Dr. Heather Gillum. Join us next week, From Destruction to Dignity. We're going to dive in a little bit more relating to eating disorders. God bless you.
We are God empowered, strength is ours, liberty, been set free, education, affirmation, dedication.